Hi there. Just just bear with me 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. Just a delivery came. So hi, how's it going? So I don't know. It feels like I've been in lockdown for quite a long time now, but I guess it's early days. So actually, I mean, I'm really looking forward to doing a bit of painting this morning, just because one thing I recognise about painting is it's so absorbing. It's an excellent thing to do at this time, or just generally. I see people in my classes, although it's not always easy painting, the amount of attention it takes up just seems to be really enjoyable in its own right. You know, the more focused you are on something, it puts your mind, you don't have to worry so much about other things which are going on. Which, if you're looking at the news now, could easily become a bit much watching it over and over again. So hopefully this will be, enjoyable for you to watch. So I'm going to do just a little quick recap. Let's have a look. Okay. So hopefully you can see that this is, if I just hold it up like that. So this is obviously from last lesson, and so hopefully you're going to be able to sort of follow what I covered last lesson in this actual painting demonstration, okay? And as I say, I will go through it step by step, but these are the main points we're looking for in our form. So I think what I'll do today is I'm going to do a painting of a pear, slightly inspired by one that I did during last term. So we're going to be looking for the highlight. The highlight goes into the mid-tones, and those two, remember, are part of our light family. And then we go into the shadows, with the core of the shadow being the sort of strongest, the darkest dark. Then we have the shadow, often with some sort of reflected light at the bottom, and then the cast shadow. So these are the things we're looking for. And these are 6 things, but don't sort of assume these are sort of like, although it's quite simple, actually observing them takes a bit of skill. And actually the subtlety with which you can paint them is something that doesn't really ever seem to reach a conclusion. You would think sort of painting these simple forms, you do it a couple of times and move on to something. But actually the simple forms, it's amazing, you have the potential just to get better and better at them. And each time I do this, whether as a diagram or even painting, you're sort of learning something. So this is like an excellent exercise for all stages of painting, but especially when you're learning, seeing the reflected light. So what I'm hoping is some of you might have had the chance to set some of these up. I know Phil, if you're watching, he set one up with a tomato and has already done a really nice watercolour painting. So hopefully some of you are going to have the chance to set this up at home. Some sort of still life with a strong light source. Observe these things and then have a go at painting them. Okay, so we'll pop that there. So, what I'm going to be doing, let's see. So I'm going to be painting on this board, and I've run out of, this is the little painting I'm going to recreate. This is one I did last term, and I was doing it on these very nice little gesso board from Ampersand, okay? So I've actually run out of those at the moment, and because of the way things are, I've actually got some of these squares cut in hardboard, so I'm thinking to revert back to the more sort of traditional sort of type, and perhaps playing around with the gesso a little bit, just to get a nice surface. So yeah, I'm going to have a go at painting one of this picture for you again, and hopefully illuminate some of the areas that we've already covered. Okay. I just looked down and noticed that I've already covered myself in paint, so it's a good start. Right. Okay, so oil paints, this is my little pochade, which sort of doubles up quite nicely in these situations. So I've got some white, some Naples yellow, Windsor yellow, cadmium yellow deep, cadmium red, French ultramarine, cobalt blue, viridian. I think that's some Prussian blue there, which I've been using sort of more recently, which gives a nice almost turquoisey greeny blue. Then burnt umber, and then I've got this combination of burnt umber and French ultramarine, which makes a very good black. So it just makes a slightly richer black than if you just bought off the shelf black. Okay. And I'm just using Terps Substitute as my sort of solvent, and a bit later on I'll be using a little bit of liquid as my medium. So the liquid enables me to paint without lose. When you use the medium, basically you're thinning out the paint. So one of the nice things about oil paint is it has this sort of creamy sort of texture. If you use too much solvent, you basically strip all the oil out and you're just left with pigment, so it's almost like a watercolour. But when it's this creamy, it's more difficult to move around. So you use a medium, whether it's something like liquid or sort of linseed oil, stand oil, something like that, and that helps the paint to move around but keep some of that body to it. So that's what I'll be using. So first thing, Norma, again, hi Norma if you're watching, asked me about toning the canvas. So often in the class what I suggest to students is to start off with toning the canvas. So I'll do that here. So I use a little bit of solvent and some burnt umber, and then put this on. Now this board is primed with this oil primer that I got from Jackson's, which was a suggestion from Tom Hughes, whose videos I've enjoyed watching. But I didn't get on with it quite so well. I just found it a little bit, let's say, it doesn't sort of hold the paint quite as nicely as some other gessos, just for my own sort of way of painting. So I'm hoping, as it's warming up, I'm going to gesso some of my own boards. And another one of my students, Anne Strulo, who may be watching, hi Anne, she has got some good results by incorporating, I think it's marble dust in the gesso. So I've got some of this marble dust, and I'm going to try and play around with that and see if I can get a nicer result. So what I've done there is apply that, but so now what I have to do is, just so you can see, is I use a cloth and wipe that off. Now just for the ease of doing that, I'm gonna just take that off and hold it. So we're wiping that because we want it to be dry. So this is what I mean by this gesso. It's a bit shiny, and what that means is it doesn't hold the paint as well at this stage. So that's a bit pale for what I've got in mind. So I'm going to try and put a little bit more pigment on. So this is why you can't use too much terps at this stage, because you want it to be, you're really looking for it to be like a mid value. So if you remember the scale I did, 1 to 8, we're looking for this to be about 4. So so not too dark, not too light. So let's get that in. Okay, and then a bit more. Now with oils, the great thing is I can add my lights on top of this, so it's not so problematic. If you're working in watercolours, I still quite like this way of working, but what you have to do is you have to remove the lights quite quickly. So you would use a slightly different way of doing it. You might do a drawing first, then lay down this mid value as a wash, and then actually pick out the highlights maybe with a sponge. And then you've established, you know, then you can work into it. But this is how I like to start with oils. Okay, so there we go. It's not too bad. Let's see, we'll just adjust this light slightly. There we go. It's a bit better. I'm just getting a little bit of glare. So you don't want glare. That's basically the light bouncing off the board and into my eyes, and it makes that area look lighter, and of course that affects my ability to perceive the tone of that area, so you want to avoid that. Okay, just looking right. Okay, so let's go straight in and we'll sketch out our object using a nice simple sort of diagram. Okay, I'll just position my reference material. Now, although it's a pear, and I'm changing the format from a square to a sort of slightly more rectangle sort of shape here, it's still important always to try and get your drawing as accurate as possible. You could say, well, it's only just a pear and I could make a generalised sort of, you know, more of an abstract pear, but it's a missed opportunity because the act of trying to get it right, you are exercising your observational sort of skills. So but you're really trying to get it as accurate as possible, and I would just encourage you to do that with whatever you're painting or drawing. Okay, so I'm going to try and change the lighting slightly, so just bear with me. Okay, hopefully that's not too bad from your point of view. I've got a little bit of a lag here, so I can't actually see what's being broadcast. It's about 5 seconds behind, so hopefully it'll be okay. This is the trouble of being live, of course. Right. So I'm using a big flat brush here, and I'm drawing with diagonals. Okay. And that helps me get this slightly blocky quality. And this avoids the trouble of everything being too rounded. Okay, when you're observing fruit, it often tends to be more cube-like. People think of it as just like a blob-like sphere, but you'll actually see there's more of this quality to it, and it tends to make the object look more sort of substantial. Okay, so that's our outline. Then what we need to do is include our cast shadow. So this is what I say at this stage is you're drawing like a diagram, almost like you're sketching it in, and it's like painting by numbers. Okay, there's our cast shadow, and we're also going to be got our stalk. Okay, so this is the first point of, so we've suggested our cast shadow, so that relates a bit to what I've been talking about, but I'm also, the reference that I'm looking at, sorry, my hands have already got paint all over them, so, we're going to get the core of the shadow in. So if you remember, that's the line that separates the light family from the dark family, okay? And this is really important to try and observe this, so you can make the effort to try and keep these families, as it were, separate as possible. So you don't paint shadows on top of things. You try and paint the shadows as distinct things from the beginning, okay? So there's our main separation, and then we're just going to include some sense background, okay? And just as a little sort of, that creates an overlap, okay? So we're going to be doing an overlap, I think, next week, okay? So the fact that this pear sits in front of that horizon line already sets up a feeling of depth, okay? So even though it's just one overlap, it helps the painting to have a certain degree of depth, okay? So there we go. So we've sketched out a diagram, okay? And this painting uses a fairly simple idea, which is a dark background, okay, with an illuminated object on top. So, and because I've already toned my board, I'm not working with our tonal scale. If this was 1, like pure white, we'd still have a lot of work to do, but I've already knocked this down. There's not quite a mid value because it's still quite light, but it will sort of do, okay? So first thing I'm going to do is block in the background. So this is what I would suggest. People like to get stuck in to the object, okay, because that's what you find interesting. But actually getting the background in and setting up the surrounding area with these simpler shapes, I've always found that to be a better sort of procedure than just getting stuck into the thing that you find the most interesting. Okay, so now I can use a little bit of liquid, although that liquid can thin the paint a little bit too much, so make just a touch, and I'll also incorporate a bit of that black in there. Okay, and in the class I'd also been doing this exercise of trying to paint with as fewer brush strokes as possible. So you can play around with that at this stage as well if you like. Okay, even though it's the background, you're trying to paint with economy. So instead of doing, you try and get one big brush stroke in. The only thing I'd say there is, when I do brush strokes for a background, the only thing I really try to avoid is painting it all in the same direction. So allow your brush strokes. Variety makes for a better painting on lots of different levels. So just trying to knit the brush strokes together, I find, makes a more sort of a better background. Your eye will recognize pattern, so if you create a background that's all in one direction, it just tends to pull the eye slightly. So I'm painting around the stalk there. As opposed to painting the stalk on top. That will illuminate it more. It'd be trickier to paint it on top of this dark. So if you haven't got the consistency of the paint right, it'll be harder to do these bigger marks. And you just have to play around with that. So if I use too much terps, okay, it becomes thinner, washed out, and it will get, at some point it will actually drip down the board. So we're looking to avoid that. We want it still to be quite rich. Okay, so we can cut around that stalk, like so. And I quite like to leave a few of those little bits, as they can add interest to an otherwise flat background, so we'll leave a few of those for the moment. We'll see what it looks like towards the end. Okay, so that's my dark background. That's really dark. And whilst let's see. So although this isn't the finished statement, I can also perhaps block in my cast shadow, because that is dark. So as I said, it's darkest and crispest directly under the form. Okay, so as we come out, it's going to lighten and diffuse. So now that's just provisional, because depending on how I do this surface, that background, that shadow may need a little bit of colour. So if I just cut in here as well, that reinforces, that now creates more of an interlocking shape, so it cuts in, which is a bit more pleasing, I think, aesthetically. So, okay, so what I might do now, what I was doing in the classes was this, is just to sort of like demonstrate the what we've been talking about. Let's just get a sense of the form. So the light's coming from this side, okay, so it hits the form quite early on with a highlight about here. Okay, now I'm just using, that's just a bit of solvent there, and that's just taken away the background. That is going to be my highlight, maybe with a little bit of one up here. Okay, now the base colour that I already established, that is going to function really as my mid value. So this area, from a tonal point of view, is going to stay about the same. And this area, the shadow, is going to be dark, but it's not going to be quite as dark in this case as the background. So I'm going to put a little bit of yellow in with my umber. Okay, maybe a bit of red. The yellow almost acts like a substitute white here, just lightens it up slightly. Okay, we still want it to be quite dark. But before I do the lights, I'm going to try and establish this shadow shape. So, obviously much darker than the highlight, but simultaneously lighter than the background. And that's going to help with this feeling of it being illuminated. Now I still want a little bit of variety in here, so I'm just going to put little notches of colour, a bit of red there and a bit of dark, just so it's not too uniform. Remember, darkest at the core of the shadow. Okay, so those little bits of red, they're just gone in there. That's almost that's what I would almost call a happy accident there, but I think that helps. Okay, actually coming up to the edge there. And now because the highlight is here, it's not like the reflected light is on the contour. The reflected light is more in the middle of this shadow, okay? So it's sort of opposite, so it's more here. So it will still, in this case, get a little bit darker towards the contour. Something like that. Remember, I don't want to, I'm trying not to overwork it here, so it's trying to let these brush strokes sort of count. So now, as you can see, that's done a lot to set up our tonal pattern. Okay, so we've got our shadows established. Now, before I do the mid values and the highlights, I'll do something with the floor, the ground it's sitting on. So what I'm going to do here is I basically want our eye to come into the pear. So I'm going to use a device of like a gradient. And what that means is I'm going to be a bit darker at the edges of the painting, and I'm going to come in and have this a bit lighter. Okay, so our eye will move towards the light, and that will bring the attention in. Okay, because although this is a bit of a nothingy area, you still want to consider it in your painting. Like, how can you make it count? So what I did is make this a slightly cooler grey. So I'm just going to use this black here, which, as I said, is ultramarine and umber. Okay, so we'll start dark and then move towards light in the middle, using the liquid here to make it flow. Just lightening the pressure slightly. And still allowing, in this case, actually allowing some of that background colour to show through. And then I'm going to add a touch of Naples yellow to it. And what's happened, it will pick up that background and create a natural gradient like that. So cleaning the brush, I can then just sort of work into that. Now the fact is, I think towards the end I might lighten that further, but the main thing is we've got a slight lightening around our form. Same here, a little bit of light there, and then allowing it to pick up and get darker as it goes away. Okay, so that's helping to, so the gradients, when the gradients help give the illusion of light, so you should always just think about the forms or the shapes that you're painting. Where is there a gradient there? Because that will tend to make it, it's a very pleasing sort of effect in a painting, a nice gradient from dark to light or from warm to cool. And I'm also going to, there you go, soften that background line, and that is going to help create some depth. Okay, so we soften that, and that's going to push that back. So it's a bit like the effect of photography, where you blur the distance, and it helps the foreground objects sort of come into focus. Okay, so there we go. So now we'll do the mid values, and this is really where we're going to put some colour. Okay, so in this case the pear had some yellow and touches of green. So I think it was a bit greener at the top. So we'll start with. But the whole thing here was not to do, you know, you have a green pear, you don't necessarily paint the whole thing like a big green sort of apple. Normally it's a case of subtle greens, like, look, see, I'm getting some umber, I'm dulling that green down. We don't want it to be too loud. So now that might be a bit dark, because remember, although I'm painting on top, I'm trying to match the tonal value that's beneath. So there's not a lot of paint, there's not a lot of brush marks in this area, but it's where the interest is, so I want to make each one count. Now in the original I do get a bit warmer around the highlight here. Okay, and it's that intense warmth that surrounds the highlight. So there's our mid values. So what I'm going to do now is just clean my brush and just soften some of that a little bit. So as I said, it's a cylindrical object. So I don't want the core of the shadow to be too abrupt all the way around, okay? So just a little bit of tweaking. Over that transition. Go. I think that's a bit better. So that has darkened it though, so I'll go back in and perhaps just lift up some of these areas. So again, thinking about where that highlight is. No white yet, this is just Naples yellow here. That gets a bit dark there. I'm also going to do a little thing which I've got on the original, which is a very nice little sort of device when you're trying to suggest a little dent, okay? So to understand how the dent works, you basically think of the light coming from the side. So the dent, you have a little shadow. Let's put the dent, where did I put it? So let's put this dent here. So a darker bit on that side and then a lighter bit on that side. So I don't know whether that you can see that very clearly, but that creates the feeling of a little dent. So it's going slightly against the tonal pattern. So, and it just gives the feeling that the pear has a bit of texture. We don't want it to be too smooth. Now, another thing I quite like to do is, first of all, you get a slight lightening on the edge of the so although that's our highlight, let's put the highlight on first. So we're going to use Naples yellow because it's not a ball bearing, so the light source isn't going to be reflected perfectly, so it will be slightly affected by the colour of the pear. So the Naples yellow, let's have a look what this looks like. Okay, now that's probably, we could go a bit lighter than that. Something like that, which I think is quite nice. And I'm sort of, part of me wants to lighten it at the top a bit more, but then of course I want my attention to be down here, so we don't want to make this top bit too interesting. Okay. So on the edge of the form, basically the form is turning away from us, so that although it's not as light as the light source, you're seeing a lot of surface area in a smaller area as the form turns away from. So you get this effect of a slight lightening on the edge of the form. And what I quite like to do, as you've probably seen in some of my, is to take some of that light or that colour and just pull that into the background. Okay, so I've exaggerated the effect there for you somewhat. But what I do now is with the, go back in using some of the dark, okay, and soften that back down. And it will still then have the effect of a slight lightening around that highlight. So that's what I'm trying to do there, is just create the feeling of a sort of glow. Okay, and look for other artists that do this. You probably see it in Carol Marine's work, and it just gives the feeling of light bouncing around. Okay, another area might be some of this yellow of the pear just being picked up under it. Okay, because this might be a slightly reflective surface. Now, I want to disguise that largely, so I'm going to just soften into it. But something like that, just to give that feeling of the light bouncing around there. Okay. Now, let's see, what else can we do? So we can do a little bit of work to the stalk. This is where it gets a little bit more fiddly. So I want the light to hit the top of the stalk, so we just darken there, and then as it comes back down towards the pear, we'll just lighten it slightly. And it even has a little bit of a cast shadow, I think, so a little cast shadow there. Again, so that's actually, like I was saying, the cast shadow of the stalk, darkest, just where it meets the stalk. Like so. Okay, now I'm sort of stepping back from it, just looking at it. Looking at the screen now, I'm not sure how well illuminated it is, but there we go. So I think the original had a bit more colour in, so I'm going to put a little bit more green in the shadow side, keeping it a dark tone. We'll put a bit of this green in. So this is like our reflected light. This is illuminating within the shadow, and with that illumination we're seeing a little bit more of the local colour, the colour of the pear itself. And if there was even more colour bouncing up off here, we'll get a slight lightening, perhaps around here. So clean the brush and just soften into that. Okay, so that's basically the reflected light. Now, it doesn't show up so well at the moment because my cast shadow is a bit light there. So if I go in a bit darker with the cast shadow, okay, that's going to make that area look a bit more illuminated. And then as I come away from that, I'm going to use the black to create a slightly cooler, maybe even stick it, let's put in a bit of blue and just make a cooler cast shadow, because the whole painting is quite warm, so if we just cool that down a bit. One of the things I was doing the other day is I went for my walk, as they were allowed to go out for a walk at the moment, and just observe shadows cast by trees on the pavement, and just look at this effect, look at the way it's denser and darker beside the object, and just try and look at how it diffuses and where's the darkest part. So sometimes the shadow might even become illuminated within, so you get a slight lightening inside of it. And the degree to which, how big is this sort of soft edge. So one of the things I try to say is you're learning to see like an artist, and part of that happens not whilst you're painting but in day-to-day life. You're squinting your eyes and you're trying to see the world, you know, with the idea of how would you paint it, you know, looking at effects of light and colour and reflection. And the more you observe in life, it will all feed into your painting. Okay, so that's a bit much. So there we go. And that's almost it. So I think what I had in the original is a little bit of Naples yellow, and then I just created a sort of more, there's a highlight here. Okay, and then that needs to be softened, but what that does is it pulls the eye in. It's acting like a spotlight, just coming into the object. And what I had in the original was the feeling of the light bouncing up. So just picking that light and bouncing it up. Again, just using the oil paint just to help create this feeling of the light bouncing around. So soft edges here and much sharper edges where our interest is. Okay. In fact, I think we could even go a bit, let's go a bit lighter in this background. So I'm putting some orange in there. Okay, and maybe even a touch of red. So this is more like playing this bit. This is just trying to get a feeling of colour and light and things bouncing around there. So again, this edge here is all very, it's like quite defined, so allowing some of that to break or become more diffused perhaps is more interesting. So there we go. I think that's the end of that demo. I think what I'll try and do is I'll take a better picture of it and put it on my Instagram page, or put it on, I might put it on the website and the Instagram page. So I'm still trying to sort out I'll find a hashtag. If you're doing any painting at home inspired by this, I will set up a hashtag and you can share whatever you've done there. And of course that hashtag can run and run. So even though we're doing these lessons in real time, for those of you that are following me, for anyone else who comes across this at a later date, you can go onto the hashtag, which I'll put in the comments below actually when I've come up with it. And yeah, so you can share your work there, and I'll be doing a crit on Friday, so send me anything in. And for any of you that are subscribed to my Patreon account, I'll send you the details now and we can have a little tutorial on Zoom, okay? In probably, let's have a break, so let's say 11:05 is when I'll set that up, okay? So thanks very much for that, and I will see you when I see you. Okay, thanks a lot, bye. on Zoom. Okay, in probably let's have a break. So let's say 11:05 is when I'll set that up. Okay, so thanks very much for that, and I will see you when I see you. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.